I know what you're thinking. How could this even happen? How does a 20-year-old fall for her father's best friend, a man old enough to be her grandfather? But trust me, I didn't plan this. None of it was supposed to happen. And yet, here I am, telling you a story that I wish wasn't true. My name is Jessica. I'm 20, a college student with big dreams, and until recently, I thought I knew what I wanted from life. That all changed last summer when Jack, my dad's closest friend, came to stay with us for a while. Jack wasn't just any family friend. He was practically part of our family. He'd been there for every milestone, birthdays, holidays, even my high school graduation. Growing up, I thought of him as a cool uncle, someone who always had great advice and funny stories. But last summer, something shifted. And once I noticed it, there was no going back. It started innocently enough. My dad had invited Jack to our annual family barbecue. I hadn't seen him in years, and when he walked into our backyard, I barely recognized him. He looked different, older, yes, but in a way that made him seem more confident, more magnetic. His laugh was louder, his stories more captivating, and for some reason, I couldn't stop looking at him. And then I caught him looking back. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Why would a man like Jack, my dad's 60-year-old best friend, even glance at me that way? But as the night went on, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Every time I laughed, he smiled. Every time I spoke, he listened. And when I walked past him, I could feel his eyes on me. After the barbecue, Jack started coming around more often. My dad said it was because Jack had recently sold his business and was looking for a change of scenery. I told myself it was nothing unusual, but deep down, I felt the excitement every time he came over. One evening, while my dad was grilling burgers in the backyard, Jack and I ended up sitting together in the living room. "You've grown up so much," he said, his voice soft. "It feels like just yesterday you were running around with braces and pigtails." I laughed, trying to brush off the nervous flutter in my stomach. "Yeah, a lot has changed." "It definitely has," he said, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. I knew then that whatever was happening between us wasn't normal. But instead of pulling away, I leaned into it. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started noticing him more, his cologne, the way his voice seemed to fill the room, the way he smiled when he saw me. And I started testing him. It was small at first. I'd wear a sundress that was just a little too short. I'd sit a little closer than necessary. And when he told one of his stories, I'd laugh harder than I needed to, just to see if he'd notice. And he did. One day, when my dad was running errands, Jack and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. I was pouring myself a glass of iced tea when he walked in, his presence filling the room. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice casual but his tone heavy with something unspoken. "I'm fine," I said, glancing at him over my shoulder. "Unless you want to pour it for me?" He chuckled, stepping closer until he was just a few feet away. "I think you've got it under control." The air between us was thick with tension. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating, but I didn't move. Neither did he. Looking back, that moment should have been a warning sign. But at the time, it felt like a game, one that I thought I could control. I didn't know then how far this would go. I didn't know that this wasn't just some harmless flirtation. But trust me when I say this, it was only the beginning. What happened next changed everything. And if you think this is wild, just wait. It gets so much crazier. After that evening at the barbecue, Jack started coming around more often. My dad said it was because Jack had more free time now that he'd retired. "He's just bored," Dad would joke, but I knew better. Every time Jack walked through the door, my heart would skip a beat. I tried to act normal, but it wasn't easy. The way he smiled at me, the way his voice seemed to drop just slightly when he spoke to me, it wasn't in my head. One afternoon, my dad was out running errands, and Jack stayed behind, saying he wanted to finish his coffee before heading home. I was reading in the backyard when he stepped outside, his footsteps soft on the stone patio. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice warm and calm. "Sure," I said, closing my book and trying not to seem too eager. We sat in silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Oh, just a novel for class," I replied, holding it up. "Nothing too exciting." "Exciting is overrated," he said with a smile. "Sometimes it's the simple things that matter." We started talking about books, about college, about life. I told him about my plans to study abroad next year, about my dream of becoming a writer. "You're very ambitious," he said, his tone filled with admiration. "Your dad must be so proud of you." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me at his words. "I hope so." "He is," Jack said firmly. "He talks about you all the time. You've grown into an incredible young woman, Jessica." His words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I noticed something in his eyes, a softness, a warmth, but also something else. Something I couldn't quite name. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the way he looked at me in that moment, it wasn't innocent. And yet, he didn't cross any lines. He didn't touch me, didn't say anything inappropriate. His words were kind, supportive, even fatherly. But underneath it all, there was a tension, an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to acknowledge. From that day on, our conversations became more frequent. He'd linger after dinner, asking about my classes, my friends, my hobbies. It all seemed so harmless, so natural. But there was something in the way he listened to me, the way his eyes stayed on mine just a little too long, that made my heart race. One evening, as we sat in the garden while my dad was inside, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You're different from most people your age," he said. "You're mature, thoughtful. It's refreshing." "Thanks," I said, trying to play it cool, but my cheeks burned under his gaze. "It's true," he continued. "You see the world in a way that's rare. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." His words felt like a compliment, but they also felt like something more. Something forbidden. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to run, to tell myself that this was all in my head. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, felt flattered. Because Jack wasn't just my dad's friend anymore. He wasn't just a kind, older man who gave good advice. He was someone who made me feel seen, understood, in a way no one else ever had. And that scared me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But every time I saw him, every time we talked, that feeling grew stronger. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I didn't know how much everything was about to change. But deep down, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't innocent anymore. I don't know when it started, this pull, this need to be near him. I'd walk into the kitchen just to catch a glimpse of him sipping his coffee. I'd linger in the living room, hoping he'd start a conversation. And when I chose what to wear, I found myself picking outfits that I knew would catch his eye. It wasn't deliberate at first. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew. I knew I was trying to get his attention, to see if he'd notice me the way I was starting to notice him. Jack noticed. Of course he did. His glances became longer, his smiles warmer. And when we spoke, his words carried a weight that wasn't there before. One afternoon, I walked into the living room while he and my dad were watching a baseball game. I wore a simple summer dress, but it clung to me in all the right ways. "Hey, Jess," Jack said, glancing up at me. His eyes lingered, just for a second, but it was enough to make my stomach flutter. "Hi," I replied, pretending not to notice the way he looked at me. My dad, oblivious, turned back to the TV. But Jack didn't. His eyes followed me as I crossed the room, and when I sat down on the armchair across from him, I could feel his gaze, warm and steady. It didn't stop there. Every time we were in the same room, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Our conversations became more personal. He asked about my favorite books, my dreams, my fears. And then, one evening, he crossed a line. My dad had stepped out to take a phone call, leaving Jack and me alone in the living room. The silence between us was thick, but I didn't mind. I liked it. Jessica, he said softly, breaking the quiet. Yeah? I turned to look at him, my heart skipping a beat at the way he was watching me. You're very beautiful, he said, his voice low and deliberate. It's hard not to notice. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My cheeks burned, and my pulse quickened, but I couldn't look away. Thank you, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze didn't waver. I mean it. You have this presence. It's rare. You should know that about yourself. I wanted to laugh it off, to brush it aside as just another compliment. But it wasn't. His words were too intentional, too loaded with meaning. That was the first time he said something that couldn't be taken back. And even though I knew it was wrong, I felt something I hadn't felt before. I felt desired. After that, everything changed. I started looking for excuses to be near him. I'd linger in the kitchen while he was cooking with my dad, offering to help even when I wasn't needed. I'd find reasons to sit next to him during family dinners. And Jack? He didn't try to stop it. If anything, he leaned into it. His compliments became more frequent, his touches more casual. A hand on my shoulder, a brush of his fingers against mine. Each time, my heart raced, and I told myself it didn't mean anything. But it did. One evening, we found ourselves alone in the backyard. My dad had gone inside to grab something, leaving me and Jack under the glow of the patio lights. You know, he said, his voice soft, I've watched you grow up into an incredible woman. Thanks, I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. You're special, Jessica. I hope you know that. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his eyes, something that made my skin tingle and my heart race. Jack, I started, but I didn't know what to say. He smiled, his hand brushing against mine. I just wanted you to know. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying his words, his touch, the way he looked at me. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. This wasn't a game anymore. It was real. And I was in far too deep. It happened one quiet evening. My dad had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day, leaving me and Jack alone in the living room. The house was silent, and the air between us felt heavier than ever. Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes flickering toward me as I flipped absent-mindedly through a magazine. Do you want to take a walk? He asked suddenly, his voice soft but deliberate. I looked up, caught off guard. A walk? The beach, he said, motioning toward the back door. It's quiet this time of night. Peaceful. I hesitated for a moment, knowing deep down that this wasn't just a casual invitation. But I nodded. Sure. The night air was cool against my skin as we walked along the shoreline. The only sounds were the waves crashing gently against the sand and the distant hum of crickets. At first, we didn't talk. We just walked side by side, our footsteps leaving faint imprints in the sand. I felt a strange mix of emotions, comfort, excitement, and a nervous energy that made my chest tighten. You've always liked the beach, haven't you? He asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, I replied, glancing up at him. It's my favorite place to think. It makes everything else feel smaller. He nodded, his hands in his pockets. It suits you. You've always had this way about you, calm but intense, like the ocean. I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. We stopped walking, standing just at the edge of the water where the waves lapped gently at our feet. Jack turned to face me, his expression serious, almost conflicted. Jessica, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. I need to say something. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. What is it? I know this isn't right, he began, his eyes searching mine. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel the way I do. His words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to say something, to stop him, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught between the thrill of hearing those words and the crushing weight of what they meant. This is wrong, he continued, his voice cracking slightly. You know that, don't you? I nodded, but my voice betrayed me. Then why does it feel so right? For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Jack took a step closer, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I've tried to fight this, he said, his voice raw with emotion. But I can't anymore. I felt tears well up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming intensity of the moment. Jack. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it was enough to send a surge of electricity through me. This is a line we can't cross, he whispered, his voice trembling. Then why are we standing here? I asked, my voice barely audible. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. But suddenly, the space between us disappeared. His hands found mine, his touch both gentle and urgent, and I felt myself leaning into him. This is wrong, he said again, but his voice was softer now, almost pleading. I know, I whispered. But I don't care. And in that moment, everything we'd been holding back, every unspoken word, every stolen glance, came rushing to the surface. We crossed the line. When I look back on that night, I can still feel the waves against my feet, the cool breeze on my skin, and the weight of what we did. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. And I knew, even then, that nothing would ever be the same. It happened that night. The house was silent, the world outside seemed still, and it felt like we were the only two people who existed. The tension that had been building for weeks finally broke. I can't tell you exactly when it started, whether it was his hand brushing against mine as we sat on the couch or the way his eyes searched mine, filled with questions neither of us dared to ask aloud. All I know is that one moment we were sitting there, pretending to watch the movie playing on the screen, and the next, the distance between us was gone. Jessica, he said softly, his voice trembling. We can't do this. But his words didn't match his actions. His hand rested gently on mine, and he didn't pull away when I turned to face him. I know, I whispered, my voice shaking. But I can't stop. Neither could he. He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek, and I felt my heart race like it was trying to escape my chest. His touch was hesitant, as though he was giving me one last chance to back away. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was careful, deliberate, like he was trying to memorize every second of the moment. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Every nerve in my body was alive, electric. I knew this was wrong, I knew it with every fiber of my being, but in that moment, I didn't care. The world around us disappeared. There was no guilt, no fear, no consequences. There was only him, his touch, his breath, and the overwhelming intensity of what we were doing. I don't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to blur, each second bleeding into the next until it felt like the night would never end. When it was over, we lay there in the stillness, the reality of what had happened slowly sinking in. I woke up the next morning with a heavy weight in my chest. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt too bright, too harsh. I turned my head and saw him lying next to me, his face calm and peaceful as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. The guilt hit me like a wave, overwhelming and relentless. My mind replayed every moment of the night before, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what we'd done. Jack stirred, his eyes opening slowly as he turned to look at me. For a brief second, there was something almost soft in his expression. But then he sat up, his face hardening as reality settled in. This has to stay between us, he said, his voice firm but quiet. No one can ever know. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my mind was spinning. This doesn't change anything, he continued, his tone almost rehearsed. It's just something that happened. But he was wrong. I knew, even as he spoke, that this wasn't just something that happened. This wasn't something we could sweep under the rug and pretend didn't exist. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. Jack, I started, my voice breaking. He shook his head. Jessica, please. We can't talk about this. It's over. It has to be. But it wasn't over. It would never be over. As he left the room, I sat there, staring at the empty space where he'd been. The night before had felt like a dream, but now it was a nightmare I couldn't escape. I wanted to take it all back. I wanted to rewind time, to undo everything that had happened. But it was too late. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a disaster. A week later, everything fell apart. I don't know how my dad found out. Maybe it was something Jack said, or maybe he noticed the way I couldn't look him in the eye anymore. But one evening, after dinner, he stormed into my room, his face red with anger, holding my phone in his hand. "What the hell is this, Jessica?" he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. I froze. My heart stopped as I saw the messages he was holding. I didn't know how he got them, and at that moment, it didn't matter. The secret was out. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. "Dad, I..." "Don't you dare try to defend yourself," he yelled, his voice breaking. "Jack? Of all people? My best friend? How could you do this to me? To us?" Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "I didn't mean..." "You didn't mean what?" He cut me off. "You didn't mean to betray me? You didn't mean to sleep with the one person I thought I could trust?" His words hit me like daggers. I tried to apologize, but it was too late. He wasn't listening. The next morning, he packed my things into a suitcase and told me to leave. "You're not my daughter anymore," he said coldly. "I can't even look at you." I begged him to forgive me, but his mind was made up. As I walked out the door, my suitcase dragging behind me, I saw Jack standing at the edge of the driveway. He looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and regret, but he didn't say a word. For a brief moment, I thought Jack and I could figure things out together, that we could find a way to move past this. But I was wrong. Jack, desperate to save his own reputation, began spinning his own version of the story. He told everyone who would listen that I was the one who initiated everything, that I had manipulated him, that I was the one to blame. "She's young," he said to anyone who would listen. "She didn't know what she was doing. I should have stopped it, but she was persistent." The rumors spread like wildfire. My dad told the rest of the family, and before I knew it, I was the outcast. Friends stopped answering my calls. Family members avoided me at all costs. "She's a homewrecker," they whispered. "She ruined everything. How could she do this to her father?" Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of their judgment. I couldn't escape it. One evening, I confronted Jack. I found him at the bar he frequented, sitting alone with a drink in his hand. "Why are you doing this to me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "You know this isn't all my fault." He didn't look at me. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink before finally speaking. "I had no choice," he said, his voice calm and emotionless. "If I didn't say something, they'd all blame me. I couldn't let that happen." "So you decided to ruin my life instead?" I asked, my voice rising. He finally looked at me, his eyes cold. "You'll bounce back. You're young. People will forget." His words made my stomach turn. "You're a coward," I spat. "You used me, and now you're throwing me under the bus to save yourself." He didn't deny it. He just shrugged, finishing his drink before walking out the door, leaving me standing there, shattered. After that, I knew there was no going back. I was alone, abandoned by the people I thought I could trust. And yet, the worst part wasn't their betrayal. The worst part was knowing that I'd brought this on myself. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I left town, hoping to leave everything behind and start over. A new city, a new life, somewhere no one knew my name or my mistakes. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, I felt like people were watching me, like they knew. The whispers, the judgment, it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from me. For months, I avoided mirrors. I couldn't look at myself without seeing the person who had ruined everything. Friends, family, my own father. All gone. But now, a year later, I see it clearly. What happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson. A painful, brutal lesson, but one I had to learn. I'm not sharing this story for sympathy. I'm sharing it because I want you to think about your own life. About the choices you make. One moment of weakness can destroy everything. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever made a choice you regret? Something you wish you could take back? Tell me in the comments.